This is the Good Government Podcast with Aaron Slutkin and Michael Hoffpauir.
Today is a unique recording of the Good Government Podcast, as Aaron Slutkin and myself, Michael Hoffpauir, are joined by Ronna from New Orleans, Louisiana. I take it you're somewhere near Uptown, Ronna.
Yep, right near Tulane.
Why is it that New Orleans is the best city in America?
We don't do that much in the world of the music and food and all of that, but it's a lively city. But I have a wonderful world here at Tulane, especially amongst our grad students. It's really a special little world we've carved out here. I don't know how long it'll last or how long I'll last, but that's kind of where my life is situated, as you can imagine.
When you first moved down there, were you quick to acclimate to the humidity and the heat? And also, were you able to concentrate right away on your work, or did it take some adjusting to cut through all of the booze and fried food before you could study again?
Well, here's my story. My husband, Robert, who just came in from work, he teaches at Xavier University here, which is a historically Black Catholic college, an unusual genre. Anyway, he had a job at the New School in New York teaching. And we had been in Germany for a year. I had a Humboldt fellowship, which was lovely. And I got the offer. I did apply. I got the offer at Tulane, which was shocking to me. I wasn't really ready. And I said, I'm just going for a year. I want to be a professor. I'm just going to go for a year. He stayed in New York and I came here. That was 1980. And I am now in my 45th year here. I can't believe it. I don't feel that old, honestly. And I've had students who tell me I had their parents. And I realize now I have to say I'm not their parents' age, I'm their grandparents' age. But, I'll walk by, like we have these, you, Michael, there's flowering plants and I don't know what they all are, but it's really pristine. Sometimes I'll walk by and the smell, I feel like the years sort of collapsed. I mean, it doesn't seem like it was 45 years here, but it has been. So, yeah.
To 45 more.
Thank you. I'll say one other thing. After Katrina, a lot of either really junior people or really senior people left the universities and everything else. And I didn't have anything direct that I rejected, but there were some, possibilities. And that's when I realized, no, this is my intellectual home. We're settled here and I don't want to leave. So it was kind of I don't know about a turning point. It was a confirmation of a commitment. And that's so unusual now. Hardly anybody of your generation lives that way anymore. The idea seems to be more to move on to a better job. And I don't blame them, right? Or get a job at all, of course. But it's a really different atmosphere. People who've been around for half a century well, of course, they're my age, necessarily. But I don't think that attitude, do you? I don't think it's as prevalent it used to be you belonged to a college and that's where you lived your life. I don't think that's so common.
As far as the city goes, I was in Baton Rouge during the storm and then was in New Orleans that summer when they opened it back up. So that would have been summer 2006, the best summer of my life. And my dear friend at the time, and then several of the people in his orbit fully committed to New Orleans at that point. Tried to make a go of it in New York, for instance, and just said, my heart's in New Orleans. And then some other people left and never came back,
Yeah. And then also a lot of young people, the social justice, do-gooder crowd and the young people were also attracted to New Orleans, but then grew to want to return. So it was interesting.
I'm going to do some producing at this point. Aaron is going to prop up a question about this book coming into being.
Okay, yeah, that's very interesting.
So, Ronna, we're here to talk today about your new book from St. Augustine's Press, The Phaedo, Platonic Labyrinth, and On Plato's Euthyphro. But I understand that in thinking about the last 45 years or your career arriving at Tulane and afterwards, that this book did not have its genesis in the last couple of years. How did you come to write it?
Yeah, that's interesting. Again, I can't believe how fast or whatever the time stretch is just hard for me to grasp. Because I really wrote it mostly in 1979. So what is that, like 26? Oh, no, 46 years ago. Yeah. So I had written my dissertation on the Phaedrus, and for some reason I thought I should go from love to death, which is I didn't know what I was doing, but that was kind of, and I really didn't. It's interesting. I think about it partly differently now because of age. Death is a lot more remote an issue when you're in your 20s than in your 70s. But anyway, I got interested in it, and I got to do, the year before I had the Humboldt, I did a reading group with Benedetti on it. And in a certain way, even though I had been in his classes, we spent a lot of time in his office. That was the only time we actually sat down and did almost a more systematic tutorial. And he sort of then let me have it, as my project. So I went to Germany. I had the Humboldt Fellowship, which was great. They just give you a year. Oh, I'll say something interesting about that. And that's when I wrote the book. And I was with Robert, who's always a great interlocutor for me, as I say, I think, in my acknowledgments. So I wrote the book up that year. But it's interesting now, looking back, two things I would say about it. One thing that's kind of obvious to a lot of people, and I mentioned this to Michael, the philosophic, these fads or something, whatever they are, the traditions, there was almost nothing at the time reading Platonic dialogues, at least not the Phaedo, in the style that is familiar to you now, and that is my approach. Almost no one looked at the literary aspects or any of that. It was really owned by what we called analytic philosophy at the time. And the style was to analyze the arguments, which are great in the Phaedo because they're all crazy, none of them work. So they get a lot to pick apart, but they don't stop and then ask. And I only realized this years later, really fully. They don't stop and ask, wait, are they deliberate? Why would Plato have done that? So I did read all, I wouldn't do it now, I'll tell you that. Don't tell my graduate students, but I read all of the analytic literature at the time. I read everything that was out there and and that was a total reversal from my Phaedrus book, which I didn't do anything like that. But somehow I felt I had to be a bona fide scholar. I read all of it. And I kind of responded to it, fortunately, just in footnotes, so it doesn't interrupt my story I'm telling. But the other thing that dawns on me only now, which is, I think, less known, I was in Germany at the time, was a movement called the academic school called the Ungeschriebene Lehre, Plato's unwritten teaching. And the two scholars were Hans Joachim Kramer and Conrad Geiser. And that was an important school, which, I knew at the time was crazy, that Plato didn't put any of his serious philosophy into. When Plato says, I don't write philosophy, they really meant it. He doesn't put any serious thinking into the dialogues. Those are just, protreptic or popular. And where does he do it? I guess they thought with Aristotle, and Aristotle's very obscure reconstructions of Platonic philosophy is where you look for the truth of Plato's thinking. So that was very extreme. And I got the Humboldt partly because my husband was already in Germany on a Fulbright writing a dissertation on Hegel, and I wanted to go. And you have to come up with something. So I wrote to the Ungeschriebene Lehre and said, I'm interested in the format of a Platonic dialogue or something. And so I was with these people. And by the way, Robert, whose German was already masterful, mine was absolutely primitive. He came to lunch one day with myself and the professor, Herr Joachim Kramer. And he said, I now see why you get along. Neither of you understand what the other is saying, but he's so formal and you're so sweet and polite. Just yeah. So anyway, that was that. But those people, here's the part that I think is a little bit of interest. Those people saw as their other Schleiermacher. They traced what they were targeting to Friedrich Schleiermacher, who read the dialogues as literary works. You have to look at the setting and the characters and so on. So I noticed when I went back, and I never went back to the Phaedo for a long time. I never taught it. I don't know, I didn't want to go back. But in any case, when I went back to it, I saw, what am I saying that this, I do, of course, in one of the early footnotes refer to Strauss, but when I'm talking about a different way of reading Plato, I refer to Schleiermacher. I say there's the analytic, there's the Ungeschriebene Lehre, and there's the Schleiermacherian approach. And I didn't, I thought, wait, why did I say that? But now I realize how much it was influenced by the German, the German horizon at the time. So it took me a long time. I'll just say one little note about this. It took me a long time to understand why is Strauss or Straussianism or something different from Schleiermacher. And I once asked Benedetti how he would describe it. I thought this was really helpful. He said, or I think he said part of this anyway, that with Schleiermacher, at the time, I still find this kind of meaningful. With Schleiermacher, there are infinite levels of understanding Plato. You'll understand it differently tomorrow than you do today. Everybody comes to it with their own take, and it's a gradual scale. It's a continuum of understanding, and you deepen your understanding by looking at certain features and so on. Whereas for Strauss, that doesn't work at all. It's so radical a turnaround. So I think the Republic is always the most obvious example, right? Either you read the Republic as Plato's sort of totalitarian, ideal for the best regime and so on, or the opposite. It's a critique of such political idealism. And there's no gradual development, radical transformation when you get at the real argument behind the surface. And I really think that we can talk about this shortly, I'm sure. That's really true about the Phaedo. So that's kind of interesting, right? I still don't think it's wrong. And I always tell students, oh, everyone develops and you get at your own level and all that. But that's missing the real meaning of esotericism as Strauss understood it, I think, and as Plato practiced it. Yeah. Anyway, that was the start of this whole project. Yeah.
Well, I thanks so much for that. I want to comment also, just as an aside, Encounters and Reflections was such a big book for me when I first started
saying that.
So thanks for that, for the work you put in that. I wish we had more things like that, and I appreciate what you just offered us because it gives us a little sense of
I know. And you
these
guys
things.
who are doing podcasts are creating that in the next generation, I think, that, we didn't have all this electronic stuff or very little of it. But, Benedetti was such a great conversationalist. I just thought, wait, this is all going to be lost. And it's a whole other world that people won't know about. And that was certainly a fun project, obviously, really fun. I was going to just add one last thing that's kind of relevant to your general framework, your interests. As that project developed, I got my husband, Robert, and Michael Davis, we got more of a sense of what we were trying to do. And at the end, the last couple of conversations, we really had a plan. Like, let's talk about this. And these are my questions I'm going to, pose. We didn't have that at first at all. And the last one would have been so important. It's so sad to me because Benedetti got sick before the last one took place and we couldn't hold it. But he had just published his book on Plato's Laws. Strauss's last book was on Plato's Laws. Benedetti and I had so many casual conversations over the years about biblical law. And he also thought about law and Greek tragedy and all the time. So I thought, wait, that's our Robert Berman, my husband, and I just came up with this conversation with plans for questions. Let's talk about law. And we never got to have that specific conversation, which is kind of a shame, obviously. And Benedetti was such an idiosyncratic thinker, you can't even really figure out what he would have said about these things.
I wasn't even going to dare to suggest you try and piece it together backwards, but keep it on the sunny side. What we have is I think a very good thing. So thank you. But why not just lean into something you were just discussing, this Schleiermacher-Strauss difference and the gradual unfolding of things, or I don't know if you want me to use the word development of things on one hand, and then the sort of abrupt turning on the other hand. Was it for you? Let's just talk about it with the example you offered, with your reading of the Republic, of whether it's a pining for the totalitarian state and rule of philosopher kings, or whether the book is about the limit of politics and the challenges of finding justice politically. Where was that for you?
I was going to go on to the Phaedo, but we can combine these points.
And then the second thing we'll do is ask you how you think that compares to the turn in the second sailing in the Phaedo.
Yes. So that's, you just said something that I guess I've thought of before, but you might say the formula for this pair that we're talking about is the second sailing, of course, and the Socratic turn. It's called a turn for good reasons. But also in the Republic, the key to this, I think Strauss's key to it, is when the whole soul is turned around, the turnaround. So you're always, Plato's esoteric writing, if we can use that formula, is about a turnaround where you're following these speeches, which you think are the arguments, but they're never really the argument of the dialogue. They're the speeches and opinions in the mouth of the interlocutors and in the situation and so on. out of which we're trying to reconstruct what is the intention, or, what's the teaching, I guess, what's the argument of the whole dialogue. And Plato's right. You're making me think, I don't know if I want to say it's always like this. I better think about that some more. But he certainly has one mode is a radical turnaround. That is, the image is the turnaround in the cave, right? You're looking at the shadows on the wall, you take them to be reality. And there's a turnaround where you suddenly, and he uses the word sudden there, by the way. You can even follow in Plato where he uses the word sudden, a sudden realization that these aren't the realities. And now all you know is that there's some artifacts behind you that have been producing those shadows. You haven't gotten outside the cave if there is an outside the cave. And by the way, one thing really interesting about the cave image that took me a while to see, you're not told how that turnaround takes place. There's no real account of that. And what I was always impressed with, but I didn't understand it properly, that the figure, let's say the representation of Socrates in the cave image is not outside the cave in reality or in nature. That's not where Socrates shows up. You probably know this, but tell me if I'm saying things that everybody knows.
No, please. We don't want to interrupt you. Please keep going.
Feel free to. So what impressed me at a certain point is there's a little guy inside the cave asking the question, what is it, as these shadows are going by? What is it? And that's the Socratic question. So that's brilliant, I think a brilliant little move Plato makes, that he puts Socrates inside the cave talking to these interlocutors. And I assumed for years he's asking about the shadows on the wall. And that's the turnaround. What is it? And then maybe the interlocutor, if he's prepared, gets a turn. But that's not what it is. It's really weird. He's asking it about the artifacts that are being carried. So I don't have a masterful answer of this yet, but I think it's such an interesting question. Plato has set it up that there's a preliminary turnaround that he doesn't tell you the source or cause of, and then comes Socratic questioning about these constructs.
Yeah, an investigation into the origin of what it is we think we know, or of our opinions, it seems there.
Yeah. And then that's not presented again as a turnaround, except, well, is that what it means to be outside the cave? We can put that aside for a moment. But it's very interesting to think about, what is that first turnaround before Socrates enters into? And I don't want to get into this yet, but I think in the course of our conversation, there might be an application of that question to the Euthyphro, or the Euthyphro might illustrate something about that question, but maybe we can come back to that later.
Let's just let it flow. Do you want to, let's talk about the Euthyphro?
I can give a short thing. It would be, as I think you guys know, many people know, Euthyphro is a kook, right? He's sort of half enlightened. He doesn't come to Socrates as a man on the street, obviously. And he certainly thinks he knows, a lot more than he thinks he really has special knowledge. But aside from that, he's heard about Platonic ideas. He's not totally in the dark when Socrates introduces, the notion of an idea or a form. He's heard about this. And he also has views about what Socrates must be as a philosopher. For example, no philosopher would think it matters whether it's your father who did injustice. That's not something a philosopher. So he's kind of enlightened. The way I put it, I think somewhere maybe in that essay, or the way I've thought about it, is Socratic philosophy is in the air. And Euthyphro has absorbed that. But it's so dangerous because this half-enlightened state, he's also hanging on to the gods of the poets, and not just that, but the most absurdly literal reading of these gods of poets and gods of the city. So and above all, their punitive character, right? What are the gods? They punish injustice. And Zeus is the highest god for that reason. And why shouldn't I be like that? So this half-enlightened state is dangerous because it's grounded in something else, or it's not integrated with Socratic philosophy. Anyway, I guess I'm thinking now there's an associated with our previous point is he's already been exposed to Socratic philosophy. he's not really sitting there chained looking at the images on the wall and thinking that they're realities. He's kind of gotten enlightened, as I put it, and turned around in some way, and yet he's not a Socratic philosopher, and it's more dangerous than an ordinary common sense person who accepts filial piety, for example. Yeah.
Yeah, it's wonderful. The danger of this being in the air is what
Yeah.
you're talking about. And I'm thinking you're thinking of Socrates' first instance where he asks Euthyphro to explain what the pious and impious are to him and asserts, and Euthyphro agrees, isn't the pious itself the same as itself in every action? And again, isn't the impious opposite to everything pious, while it itself is similar to itself and has one certain idea in accordance with impiety, everything that is going to be impious? Euthyphro replies, entirely so, doubtless, Socrates.
Yeah.
But as the Euthyphro continues, as the dialogue continues, Socrates has to try, 3 more times to explain to Euthyphro what it is to think about something in terms of its idea.
Exactly.
So while it's in the air, and I think I understand it, I have no understanding of it, and perhaps that also underlines the danger all the more. A little bit of philosophy or a little bit of Socratic philosophy is dangerous for a guy like Euthyphro, or maybe for most human beings.
Totally. And I like Strauss's point about this is, I think Strauss puts it in terms of Glaucon and Adeimantus, or Glaucon and the Republic. But why are they so ready to accept this crazy theory of ideas? And that's where I think it's one of the most influential and interesting points Strauss makes with broad implications, that the ideas, and by the way, this comes out in a letter by Strauss to Benedetti, the ideas are the replacement for the gods.
Right.
That the Greeks had a god Nike, or victory. And that god is such that no matter what victorious moment anywhere, the god is somehow present, or that moment is participating in the god. So, and that god doesn't come into being and pass away. And so that the characteristics of the ideas are already adumbrated in the gods, or the mythological gods, especially those Hesiotic gods like strife or victory. And so, so that's a familiarity that makes the ideas sound more familiar than they should sound, or the theory of ideas. So.
And so it just should be said, for those who have yet to pick up the book, rush to your local bookseller and get it. The Phaedo, A Platonic Labyrinth's current edition has this Plato's Euthyphro from Professor Berger essay attached at the end. And this is, I believe, a lovely footnote, what you were just riffing on there about Nike and Nemesis and so forth in it. It's a lovely essay. But if I can pull us back now, we're still thinking about turning. And so we've moved from the Republic to the Euthyphro. How about in the Phaedo?
Yeah. And by the way, I never answered your question. About what I think about the
Republic. Well, I was saving that for fourth. I was going to say, okay, well, most importantly, tell us about you and your own. I was going to take us
come back to the Republic.
I remember.
I mean, you sort of I'm sure assume, and you would be right, that I think that it's a critique of political idealism and not a blueprint. But there's a lot more to say about that we could come back to.
I see.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Anyway,
Thank
the
you.
Phaedo, I don't know if certainly not when I wrote the original book, I didn't think of it in this framework, but it's a really great example. This, at least the first half of the dialogue, and in a way, the whole dialogue, you think that it is meant to be an attempt to prove the immortality of the soul, that the soul will be separate from the body after death, and that'll be so desirable because it will allow for union with the pure ideas. The soul will be, as they put it, freed from the prison of the body. And that's what the arguments seem to be trying to establish. And of course, on my reading, I shouldn't say of course, on my reading, that's exactly the target of critique. The whole dialogue is, when you read it properly, with all of the moves you have to make, with the characters and the needs and what people desire and what Socrates is up to in the situation and all of it, and the flaws in the arguments, I think you come out with the conclusion that it's a disproof of the immortality. I go pretty far. Some people would say agnostic. I think it is a disproof of the immortality of the soul. And at least in the argument that is the most sound argument, is so minimal. The fourth and last argument the only one in the second half of the dialogue, establishes this, to jump ahead probably of where we are, but establishes that the soul is the principle of life in the body. And by the law of non-contradiction, that cannot be dead. So as long as the soul exists, it can't be dead. And he's got a lot of strong argumentation to show that that's a sound point, but it doesn't say anything. I guess to be moderate, you have to at least come to the conclusion that it doesn't tell you anything about whether the soul will exist in any way after death. I think you can go further than that, but we can return to that. So that's a turnaround, a real turnaround. And more, I should have put it differently. I think the better way, the more objective way to put it is, the whole dialogue is structured as a turnaround. You get the first, and this is a common strategy of Plato's. I think, people joke about it, but you really can get a huge hint by the middle of the dialogue, the central line, the first line, the central line, or the central passage. And we might want to talk about that some more too in the Phaedo. But in any case, the Phaedo clearly, I think, divides into these two halves, or pretty clearly divides into two halves. And that's a turnaround. And within that, you get the story of Socrates' autobiography with his own turnaround. So again, these are all things I think can develop more fully, but you could say that the formula for the Socratic autobiography, the turnaround, is exemplified by the dialogue, by the structure and arguments of the dialogue. So, and it's radical, right? I still think the Schleiermacher is very common sense. Yeah, you understand it better the second time around, and you understand it better than your freshman students might, hopefully, and you get a little deeper each time, you see more, and all of that is true. But what it means to be esoteric is, I think, open to the possibility of this real reversal. Hard to think why that's necessarily so, but I think that is Plato's premise.
Aaron, I think you had a question that would fit right here.
Yeah, I did. It's a question about the center of the dialogue as you identify it. You argue that Socrates might intentionally have exposed problems that end up threatening trust in reason itself. It's this fear of mythology. Socrates, in giving bad arguments that don't convince his interlocutors, threatens that on his day of departure, they might come away not believing that arguments can lead to truth. If intentional, that seems like quite a risk, especially because he won't be there to clean up the mess afterwards. And I would think that if you were willing to engage in a risk like that, a prudent man would have to know something about the character of the students to whom he's speaking. So what do you understand Socrates understands about his students, the ones who were engaged with him on his last day?
It's such an interesting question, Aaron, because I would also say Plato often is amazingly risk-taking. Just as an aside before I plunge in, think about the Republic. Like you've absorbed, I absorbed in my training. Well, esoteric writing means there's a surface that's salutary and that's useful, right? More moral, more politically sound, and so forth. And then you think about the Republic. What? No, if I'm right, and the Philosopher King is the surface, people claim that it's a model for totalitarian regimes. That's not a salutary. So that's a big question. But to go back to your important point, here's the starting point, I think. What I discovered, I remember it took me quite a while, but the center of the Phaedo, I called it the extended center, because the mythology argument is really getting it going, is the center. But it extends all the way through Socrates' autobiography, his account of his second sailing, and his description of this so-called hypothetical method of reasoning. And at the end of that, which is kind of shocking, everybody, all the people present and the guy listening to the conversation says, oh, he cleared up everything. Now the whole thing makes so much sense. We understand it all. That's the final response to the mythology point. And that's kind of weird. We might want to also come back to that. Why that crazy technical account is so persuasive and so enlightened to everyone that it clears up everything. But to start with mythology, it's, I don't know if in my original writing I understood just how very important it is. But I like, he gives the analogy, which is so useful. Misology is parallel to misanthropy. And misanthropy is very familiar to us, right? You have naive views about how perfect human beings are. You expect everyone to live up to such a high standard. And if you really, not just expect it, but if you really assume that's how human beings are and should be, you're going to be disappointed. Almost no one lives up to that. Everyone has their flaws, and a lot of people fall very far short of it. So you're going to go around embittered and despairing and very vulnerable to giving up on respect for human beings at all, because your false standard, your elevated standard, led you to despair when reality hits you in the face. That's misanthropy. And he's trying to give an account of that about logos or argument, that you have if you come to it with an inadequate understanding of what argument is capable of doing, what reason is capable of showing us. And you're going to find, he says, not every argument, some are good, some are better than others, but you're bound to find flawed arguments often enough, if not for the most part. And if you had such a high standard, it can lead you to despair about the possibility of reason altogether. By the way, I had a kind of, I won't go, we can come back to the issue of whether fear of death or misology is the real, and the real problem of the Phaedo. They go together in any case. But yes, this is, as Socrates does say at one point, it's the greatest evil. Misology is the greatest evil because it will lead you to throw away rationality altogether, or it can. And so he's trying to, his whole thing is to combat misology. But what's interesting, Aaron, about the way you put it, and I think that's correct, it's almost like he pushes them to confront weak arguments or fallacious arguments in order to pull the rug out from under any trust they might have in reason. Again, very risky. And I think what might be clear to a lot of people, if they go back and look at the Phaedo again, or readers of the Phaedo, the first two arguments, it's not so clear. They're really difficult. The cycle of Genesis and recollection, they're very complex and difficult. But the third argument is completely, clearly mythological, right? If you were nasty, you're going to be born again as a wasp. And if you were a good citizen, you'll be born again as a bee or a swan or something, right? It's a kind of a spoof on Pythagorean reincarnation. We might also want to develop that some more. But it's meant to, they all resist that, right? They all realize that there's something gone wrong here, that this is not persuasive. So, yeah, I think that Socrates deliberately has to lead them to some kind of disappointment in the arguments, which arguments were based on assumptions about how powerful logos can be, how much you can understand the nature of reality from argument directly. And so he puts them through this experience. They then raise their objections. Then he gets to respond to their objections and do, part of his turnaround is, what then is logos capable of? And only this recent time through the Phaedo, I didn't think about it this way, I'm sure the first time through, when I wrote the book at least, that I realized that the first and second sailing, or the highly idealized understanding of logos versus the moderated one, is kind of a version of revelation and reason. I think it's sort of a version of that the expectation for what rational argument can do is an expectation that it will give you a revelation, direct, you open your mind, right? Just like you open your eyes and you see a color, you open your mind and your mind's eye sees the truth. It will come to you like that. And that's really, Plato, I think, had a kind of notion. I'm bracketing what role, if any, a god or God might play there, but he had an idea of something like revelation, a direct opening up of the truth to the mind, to the mind's eye. And that's the false expectation that when you get into reality of discussion, you're going to be disappointed and then you'll despair. So he has to correct that. And does that get us started, Aaron?
And Aaron,
Or
excuse me
Michael?
And dramatically, what would make me throw out all of these arguments that I've held up for most of my life,
Yeah.
facing my death?
Yeah.
The dramatic structure of the dialogue makes it very easy, aside from maybe just the frustration we might experience and our limited ability to reason. But
Yes.
nonetheless, I've lived my whole life and here I am now.
Yeah.
And this is definitely something Socrates is forced to defend himself against. And he does so, I think, well, in the dramatically prior dialogue, the Crito, of course. I'm not able to throw these arguments out now that this situation has befallen me.
It's a neat connection. Yeah.
Still abide by these arguments, but then he tests them again. And as you articulate, Ronna, the whole point here is to restore confidence in reason. It is an effort at self-persuasion.
Yeah.
Who's Socrates doing this for? Is
Yeah.
a wonderful question.
And let's just add one point to that again is more of a question than anything, but it seems the most obvious and natural answer, and you could say the easier answer is for his interlocutors and Plato for his readers. But I also got interested in the question whether there's some way in which Socrates has to do this for himself. I don't have a firm view about that, but I think it's an interesting point to ask oneself. Does he have to, in a way, persuade himself to retain trust in Logos?
Dramatically, I love the opening of the Phaedo with the expulsion of Xanthippe. And I'm
You're the
jumping
only
ahead.
one!
Oh, well, I think it's so wonderful because Phaedo says she was saying things like women always say, and then I would expect her
Why
to
are
say
you
something.
dying?
Yeah, but I would expect her to say, like, I can't believe you did this to me, Socrates. I'm stuck with these 3 kids. We got no money. I can't believe you. I don't have a husband. She would moan and wail about her own, but she says, Socrates, this is the last day you'll be able to talk with your friends and your friends with you.
That's true.
That's
yeah.
not the kind of thing anybody would be saying, except an
I see.
extremely learned person.
That's
And-
an interesting observation. I don't think most people notice that. Also, at the end of the dialogue, when the young men break down, Plato has this is what the women were supposed to do.
Right.
Yeah.
But when Socrates says, Crito, get her out of here, why does he have to get her out of there? It's not because she's just moaning and wailing as women would often do in such a situation. I think what she says there is what I always have wondered. It would push him to breaking down completely. And therefore, the speeches that come offer this sort of therapy, this attempt at maintaining this faith or hope or resilience in the arguments.
Yes. So there's one point where, there are a couple ways you could get at that. At the end of the dialogue, Socrates covers his face and then he uncovers it and covers it again. So I think the standard reading or a mainstream reading of the Phaedo is, and Plato certainly pushes you to this, Socrates is superhuman. He has such composure. He has such equanimity in the face of death. This is what it means to practice death and dying. He's not afraid. He's right. So you have that image. But I think Plato gives you enough hints to undercut it. He's a human being. He doesn't want to die. He led a good life. He's leaving behind so much, and you don't just erase the fear of death. So, I know what I was going to say. Is this in the mythology argument? I forget where it comes. At one point he says, and I'm trying to, because I might be not objective myself, since this is the day I'm dying. And maybe it's my fear of death that's leading me to these arguments.
Right.
And so he kind of opens that up. But my reading was, once you say that, once you're aware of that, you've transcended it.
Nice.
He's aware. He says, I might be more of a lover of victory than a lover of truth. But if you really were a lover of victory, you wouldn't be aware of that. So, but still, Plato wants you to, I think, and this is kind of new to me too, I think throughout the dialogue and the way you're saying in many ways in the drama, Plato wants to remind us he's a real human being that we recognize. Socrates is. And this is a very sad occasion. And he doesn't want to give up his life. So it's got to understand why he decided to do so.
I would always ask students to think through that unfortunate situation when they were in the presence of a dying loved one. And if they're so fortunate so as to not have had experienced that, to just think about a funeral of a nearby loved one and say, okay, well, just try and at least put yourself in that disposition or in that mood or space, and then read this book and watch how it is that there are funny moments that can erupt out of this. But human beings are trying to find a way of processing death.
But Plato's a little bit cynical, I think, that it's interesting to try to track down the psychology of the interlocutors. I would say, yes, the primary thing is sadness. They're losing this teacher and friend, and they don't think he's replaceable. But they also have some kind of anger or resentment at Socrates for abandoning them. Yeah, so it's such a complicated mixture. They pity him, they're angry at him. They think he's getting what he wants and leaving them behind. There's a lot of mixed feelings. And at one point, Socrates says, if I didn't think I was going to human beings better than I see now, that's a really nasty thing to say to them. And they also accuse, this is the important thing, and again, we can come back to it later, but the important thing they say is they're accusing him of, I think it's Cebes who accuses him of imprudence. Here we are. Life is under the guidance of a god, and you're giving up on it. That's not reasonable. That's imprudent. And Simmias accuses him of impiety.
Mm-hmm.
No, injustice. You're being unjust. You're leaving behind your friends who need you. So, and then he addresses impiety, Socrates does. So you get three targets, right? Is Socrates' death a matter of, can we blame him for imprudence, injustice, and or impiety? And what's, I think, really interesting is, this is the thing we have to come back to in a bigger picture, but nobody acknowledges that he's been put on trial, and this is the conviction. The city gave him the death sentence. He did not freely choose this death out of nowhere. They're acting as though, right, you're leaving us behind, unjust. You're leaving behind the gods, imprudent, impiety. They don't say, what's your attitude toward the trial and conviction? So that's a bigger picture we'd want to think about.
Part 2 of your preface helps us think about how much all of the Platonic dialogues are about how Plato thinks philosophy can be preserved now that Socrates is gone. You even have a beautiful line I'd like to read on page 30 of the preface. And this is after you've worked through the various post-Socratic schools, and we can go back to that, of course. But I'll just read the paragraph in an effort to be faithful. This is the first full paragraph on page 30 of the preface. Plato's depiction of the post-Socratic schools, their doctrines and traditions, suggests what ancient philosophy would have become if we did not have in the Platonic dialogue the enactment of Socratic philosophy through the representation of the living Socrates. The realism of that representation shows the limits of Socrates' urging Phaedo and the others not to mourn for his death. But Socrates does offer a horizon for experiencing or understanding that loss when he advises mourning instead for the death of the Logos if they fail to keep it alive. He identifies the meaning of his life with the life of the Logos. If that counts as the philosopher's paradoxical practice of dying and being dead, it is accomplished, finally, by Plato's writing. No Plato without Socrates. No fulfillment of Socrates' life and death without Plato. The Platonic Socrates is a true indeterminate dyad.
I'm going to get in trouble for that last line.
I had to read that and just get your reaction to it.
Well, if you stop short of the Benedetti formula indeterminate dyad, I think people do kind of, don't you think, at least nowadays, I think most people do recognize that Plato, for the most part, we have these interesting dialogues where he chose other spokesmen, but for the most part, Plato stays behind the scenes and everything takes place through Socrates. I won't call him a spokesman because we don't know for sure if Plato endorses everything, but Socrates is his representation of the philosopher. So he's standing behind the scenes of Socrates. And I think Nietzsche is really good on this point, actually. But on the other hand, what would have happened? I mean, Socrates didn't write. He didn't preserve his way of discovery of philosophy. And I think the easy answer, which I think is the true answer, he knew Plato was going to do it. He had Plato. But yeah, that's what really all I mean, that they are so intertwined and so interdependent. But what's interesting is in these it's especially the narrated dialogues. I think most people know the majority of Plato's dialogues are direct dramas, but some are narrated in literary form. And some of the narrations, 4 of them I count, have a narrator other than Socrates, usually many years after the death of Socrates. And the Phaedo, of course, necessarily fits into that. But it's the Theaetetus, the Symposium, the Parmenides, and the Phaedo for various reasons. And what dawned on me is in these 2 of the dialogues to show you Socrates becoming Socrates. Socrates before he's really discovered political philosophy. And 2 of them are at the end of his life, right? The Theaetetus and the Phaedo. So what's interesting to me, or what became interesting to me, is in a way, Plato shows you Socrates choosing those narrators. He has a certain affection for Phaedo. Clearly, he singles him out to convey and to preserve this conversation. And in the Theaetetus, it's much more explicit, more complicated, because he actually keeps reporting the conversation to the future author of it, Euclides. So Plato portrays Socrates at the end of his life, perhaps for the first time, really thinking about his succession. What's going to happen after I'm gone? I'm withdrawing. How is philosophy going to be preserved? And, one thing that this is a controversial issue that I've had interesting debates with people about, it has to do with the difference between philosophy as such and Socratic philosophy or Socratic political philosophy. And one idea, which I'm inclined to accept, but other people have disagreed with me, philosophy as such is not as fragile. It shows up in a lot of places. It started with Thales. I got this a lot from Al-Farabi, who says philosophy as such, it was passed on to us from the Babylonians to the Egyptians to the Syrians, right, to the Arabs and so forth. Maybe it pop up anywhere. But you wonder whether Socratic political philosophy might not be more unique and more fragile and more in need of protection or preservation. It doesn't show up everywhere and always. It's not, you could link this. I think I'm just thinking this for the first time. Everyone knows the famous Cicero line that Socrates dragged philosophy down from the heavens and brought it into the homes and the cities. Implication of that line is that it's unnatural, or it's not the natural way of philosophy. The natural philosophy is to think about the universe, right? And so that's another, you could connect that maybe that natural impulse of philosophy can show up anywhere. Maybe it's not even Western or something like that. I think it might be, but maybe not. But Socratic political philosophy is more idiosyncratic and more unique and more in need of protection. And Plato was aware of that, would be the point. These schools of philosophy that are represented by the narrators. So the Phaedo world is the Neo-Pythagoreans. They have a Pythagorean tradition. And the Theaetetus world they were the school of the Megarians that Aristotle talks. You can find information in Aristotle's Metaphysics about these schools. So you have the Pythagoreans and the Megarians, and I'm most interested these days in the Eleatic stranger of the sophists and statesmen who are Neo-Parmenideans. Well, first of all, I'll say generally, I think you always have schools after a great philosopher. There was a Cartesian school, right? There's a Hegelian school, Heideggerian school, Straussian school. You always have schools. And you kind of need schools because there's not going to be a great philosopher every generation. I think the person who's written about this very well is Heinrich Meyer. He talks about the problem and the need for these schools of philosophy. And what the school does, the way I tried to put it is, someone like a thinker like Socrates, you can't pin him down, right? Both because he's ironic and because he thinks about everything. The schools carve off some feature or some doctrine and make that a premise of their whole approach to thinking and to understanding. It's got to be doctrinaire. A school is almost by definition passing on certain doctrines because that's what you can transmit. So the school loses the living essence of the real philosopher, but it preserves something that can maybe be recovered again later. So my question was, and I want to add to that, interesting. I don't know if I have an answer to this, but interesting that all these schools are going back to pre-Socratic philosophy. They're all pre-Socratic, really. So Socratic philosophy, Plato's almost saying, well, I think I like the way I did put it, without me, right? There were pre-Socratic philosophy, first sailing, then came along Socrates and made a turn. But the succession after Socrates withdraws and his thinking is then transmitted through these schools for whatever reason, which is hard to explain, is going to go back to the pre-Socratic mode. Megarian is pre-Socratic, Parmenidean is pre-Socratic, Pythagorean is pre-Socratic. So that's really kind of hard to think through. Is political philosophy or is somehow Socrates can't be preserved that way? And Plato realized, I've got to do it in these dramas. Keep the living Socrates before our eyes as a unique individual. So, yeah, this problem of succession is so interesting, I think, everywhere. I'm also into the biblical problem of succession, but maybe for another conversation.
When reading this line you have where you go, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and then you use the word miracle and give us an exclamation point. You reminded me in that sentence of Discourses on I think it's 119, where Machiavelli speaks of the possibility of having two excellent princes in a row. And
Oh, wow.
if this were to happen, it would be a principality as the world has never seen before. Because
I'm
typically we
putting a
just
note down.
yeah, I'm pretty sure it's Discourses 119.
Yeah.
But the rule being, of course, you typically just get doofus after doofus. Maybe you get a decent person every once in a while.
I mean, the whole issue of how in all, I think, not philosophy only, right, or statesmanship, but also art, music, literature, right? You don't always have a great one, but we need ways to preserve these traditions. That's part of education. But how do you recover? Oh, I was going to say, I think I mentioned this to Michael before. Another clue I got with this Farabi thing, he actually has two statements about this, right? The one is, and philosophy was passed down to us through every known source, Babylonian, Egyptian, Chaldean, Syrian, to the Arabs, Greeks and Arabs. But then he says, and philosophy in the true sense was passed down to us only by Plato and Aristotle. It's so, you have to be at least struck by this apparent contradiction. What does he mean there? I don't know if I'm right about this at all. As a matter of fact, I think I might not be right, but I'm tempted to want to say that latter is Socratic political philosophy, but I'm not sure about that. That's really something I'm intrigued by. But he says what Plato and Aristotle passed down to us is philosophy in its true form and how to recover it when it's been lost, which is obviously what Farabi thought he was doing. So there's something about the Platonic Aristotelian version of philosophy that's concerned with the recovery of this lost heritage that maybe isn't true of all philosophy.
Ron, I wanted to ask you, in conjunction with a paragraph that precedes the one that Mike read, this is on page 30 of the preface. You say, in the middle of his last conversation, Socrates warned his companions of the great evil of misology, which amounts to the self-destruction of philosophy from within. But there is also a misology writ large, we might say, exhibited in the city that's found Socrates' examination of opinion so threatening it condemned him to death. Socrates, in his death day conversation, struggles to save philosophy from internal self-destruction. Plato, through his art of writing, portrays that effort and draws his reader into it, while aiming at the same time to protect philosophy from the potential lethal misology of the city. I think that points to something you just said about the comparative fragility of Socratic political philosophy, but I want to ask a question that we
Yeah.
discussed a little bit earlier. What the Phaedo suggests about the possibility of the Socratic method as applied to nature? What is it about the human things that are more, let's say, findable in the true sense than
Yeah.
nature? Can the human things with their special status lead us toward an understanding of nature?
Yeah. That's such an important and fundamental question. Let me just say one thing about that paragraph. When I think about it now, very self-critically, in a way, it's very loose that I'm calling that mythology. I mean, I was right, and I think it was important to try to connect the whole issue of the fragility of reason and philosophy in its own development with the problem of the city and the suppression of philosophy, right? And this Plato got going, presumably because of being shaken up by the trial and execution of Socrates. So I was right to connect them. Whether you really could call that latter thing mythology, I don't know, very loosely, right? Distrust of reason. But anyway, yeah, let's go back to the Socratic turn, really, is, I think, and I realized there's an interesting clue to this in Aristotle's metaphysics. So many people, maybe most people, understand the Socratic turn as a turn to the human things, like Cicero. Cicero presents that very clearly. It's a turn to the human things. And in a way, that means giving up on the quest for knowledge of the whole or knowledge of nature in reality as a whole. It's abandoning that aim and developing a more moderate or a different aim to understand human life. That's probably the most common understanding. And you get it, you think you get it from Aristotle's metaphysics, who basically says that Socrates turned to the human things. But I noticed, and this saved the day for me, I noticed that Aristotle adds almost the next sentence. He adds something like, and that was the beginning of definition, like what is X, and the source of Platonic ideas, which are by no means restricted to the human things. So Aristotle, in a way, corrects himself. And we might, I don't know if we have time, but an interesting question for people to consider is whether Aristotle continues the Socratic turn or whether he abandons it. A quick answer. In the Ethics, I would argue very firmly that he continues the Socratic turn and he is a pure Socratic. But what about the theoretical works, the natural science works, De Anima even? That's another question, really hard question. But to go back to the way you put it, Aaron, here's how I think of it. And I owe a lot of this to Strauss, I would say, but the way I see it is he turned in, well, it's complicated. We know he brings in the human things in the autobiography as merely an analogy to what he was disappointed with in Anaxagoras. Anaxagoras was studying the cosmos as a whole and offering another natural theory, scientific theory. And wow, it sounded great. Mind puts the whole universe into order. And I like that, says Socrates. And I thought, says Socrates, if mind puts things into order, it must do so with a view to the good or the best. So he brings up Anaxagoras famously for cosmological teleology. And then he says, he didn't really pull it off. And my disappointment is illustrated by this analogy. It would be as if someone said, Socrates does everything he does by mind. And then you ask, why am I sitting here with you guys now today in this prison right on the last day of my life? And why am I conversing with you? And the Anaxagorean model would be because your bones are linked in a certain way, the sinews bend and you can bend your hip and sit on your chair. And I'm conversing with you because you have the tongue and lips and stream of sound that allows human beings to speak. That's like would be the Anaxagorean answer to the question. And then Socrates says, but that would miss completely the true causes. Let's come back to that in a minute. And that's my intention. Why did I decide to choose death? I think the most kind of important thing in a way to notice is this is the only time in the whole dialogue explicitly where Plato reminds the reader that this whole conversation belongs in the context of Socrates' trial and death. That's been completely covered over. I mean, the arguments for immortality are a big veil in a way. The soul imprisoned in the body is a veil. You've completely forgotten that he's imprisoned in the Athenian jail because he was condemned for corruption and for not believing in the gods of the city, and they sentence him to death, and he's going to be executed now. So you completely forget that, except for this one moment that lasts for how long? Like 2 or 3 sentences. That's it. And it's near the center of the title. It's the center of the center.
We're reminded of this at the beginning of the dialogue. And then as soon as we start discussing what happens to a good man upon death and the soul, we just are whisked away from all of the reality of this situation.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it's lurking there at several points, especially as you say at the beginning and the Athenians but in any case, now we're slapped in the face. He is there because of the trial and conviction. And I want to come back in a minute to what he says, because that's also important. But to go back to try to address Aaron's big question, all Socrates then says is, I couldn't find anyone what I could do for my own action. What is my intention, and what were the mechanisms and matter that enabled me to fulfill my intention, bones and sinews and voice and all that. I couldn't find anyone who could pull that off on the cosmological level, and I couldn't do it myself, so I made a second sailing. He doesn't exactly deny that it's possible. He's not in a position to deny that it's possible, but he just sort of pushes it aside. So the big question that Plato leaves you with is this kind of teleology really only applicable to human life? Maybe animal life, you could have a version, but to living beings who do have intentions and purposes? Let's stick to human beings. Is that where teleology resides? Which it does, because we choose things, we make decisions based on our understanding of what's good, and then we luckily have bodily possibilities of fulfilling that. It's at home. Teleology and its subservient mechanism is at home in human action. Does it have a place in nature and in the cosmos? That question is left so much in the background. It's not directly addressed, I think. So does that mean then that Socratic philosophy, then you wonder, then that means Socratic philosophy must be restricted to the human things, because that's what he's explaining. And you can make this move, which I think is more important than it might seem. The human things are a kind of being, an eidos, or a species, or a class of being. Being is not, like the pre-Socratics thought, one homogeneous whole with an ultimate first principle from which everything can be derived. Water, okay, we can get rid of that. Or Parmenidean being, for example. No, you cannot, it is not adequate to look at reality or nature as an integral, homogeneous whole derived from one ultimate arche, or first principle, which I now see is really a pre-Socratic term. So he's rejecting that in a way implicitly, because if human beings are a distinct kind, that is a key to nature as a whole, or being as a whole. The way Aristotle puts it is, being falls into the kinds. Strauss's formula alluded to a moment ago. Strauss's formula, which I think is very useful once you get it, is noetic heterogeneity. Everyone agrees there's perceptual heterogeneity. You look around the world, you don't just see being, right? You see cats and they look different from oak trees, and they look different from human beings, and they look different from fish. We perceive kinds, and Plato purposely uses for his word for kind a word that has a visual implication. Eidos belongs to the visual realm. But the Platonic transformation is, these are noetic kinds. These are intelligibles, which the mind can seek to grasp. So, Aaron, do you see how I'm getting a roundabout response to you, that the turn to the human things, and Socrates himself did not then proceed, presumably, to spend his life thinking about whether the sun is in the center of the universe or something else. He did spend his life thinking about the human things. But Plato's version of the Socratic turn has the direct implication that the human things are a key to all beings, which he says. puts it in the mouth of Socrates, the turn to logoi, the turn to examination of opinion in speeches is a way of investigating the beings. Instead of direct investigation of beings, we might want to come back to that, it's an indirect investigation of the beings. So that means it isn't restricted to human life. And I think it's on the basis that I'm just suggesting, once you see that human beings are a representation of kinds, and that being as a whole is articulable into kinds, and we have sciences because we have kinds, which Aristotle understood. You have biology, you have chemistry, you have physics, you have mathematics.
And so the opinions, therefore, which we investigate disclose something of what is.
Yes.
And this leads me to your concluding paragraph in your preface, where you say, Plato's dialogues preserve the life of the Logos by the recovery of Socratic political philosophy, which requires the rediscovery of Socrates the individual. That rediscovery is possible because Plato's Socrates discloses himself enough to make us aware of what he has hidden. His sudden reflection, for example, on the political conditions of his situation at the center of the Phaedo. Surely Socrates' collision with the city has brought a painful recognition of the need to be circumspect, but Plato indicates beyond that pressure the intrinsic and essential grounds for the need to uncover the being of the philosopher behind his appearances. If the philosopher is a hunter, and so hard to tell apart from the sophist, it is because the beings he seeks to know do not offer themselves openly to him. He has to camouflage himself and come upon his prey in a crafty way without being sure what he will track down. The problem is acute when it is the philosopher himself who is the ultimate object of the search. It is as necessary to find an indirect path as it is in the case of the blinding light of the eclipsed good. When Socratic philosophy leaves the Athenian prison in the form of Plato's narrated dialogues, it does so just as Socrates worries he would have had to do, wrapped in a leather skin or whatever disguise runaways don to change their own figure.
I love that last thing. That was one of my first insights. I got it from a friend, Stephen Berg, who told me that word. I have it in the Biblos, when they wrote on parchment. And I didn't fully understand the significance of how much fun it was to say what I said. But then I came to see what these narrated dialogues are, a sort of disguised. You have to have the premise here. Socrates says, "I didn't. If I had just gone with my immediate sense of what's good, if I had just gone with my desire for what's good, these bones and sinews would have been carried away long ago to Megara and Boeotia." That's Thebes, right? I would have run off. Life is good. Socrates believes life is good. His immediate impression of the good would have been to stay alive and preserve his life. He had to really do a lot of work to hold back from that. That was kind of blinding, and he had to examine opinions to refine that, to understand what his true good was. But then I got this thing, the travel journey to Megara and Boeotia is the Theaetetus and the Phaedo. Plato must have been laughing so hard, right? I can send philosophy off. Socrates himself decided to die in prison and not run off to these two cities. But I'm sending philosophy off in the Phaedo to one of them and in the Theaetetus to the other in disguise. So, yeah, and the Crito was the key to that because the word appears there. So, I think this ties in with a lot of what we've been talking about. Here's how I would put the paradox. The Phaedo is the dialogue in which, or maybe it's a dialogue, I think it might be the dialogue, in which Socrates is presented with his discovery of political philosophy. We didn't even really state how that shows up, but he discovers political philosophy here. And yet, the image of the philosopher that you get in the dialogue is so radically apolitical. It's really a paradoxical thing. The philosopher of the Phaedo is, as presented in most of the speeches, at least in the first half, is, this you can say it very clearly, hates the body. It's all about asceticism and hatred of the body. The genuine philosopher, as he calls it, wants to escape from the prison of the body so his soul can be in touch with the ideas. The body is the source of all our problems. And it has nothing whatsoever to do with political philosophy. That picture of the philosopher And there's another version of that, you could say, in the Phaedo. So that's, we might want to leave it for people to think about, but it's an interesting paradox that the dialogue which shows us the Socratic discovery of political philosophy should give us an image of the philosopher that's so apolitical, with only a hint in that central passage of the political context of this whole situation. And if nothing else comes across to people, I think an important thing to convey is the genuine philosophers that are on the surface of the dialogue hate life. They hate the body and they hate life. Whatever keeps them alive, Plato's thinking about that. But they really want death because they think that'll be the good, the separate soul in contact with the separate ideas. And so the whole turnaround of the Phaedo, the whole trick of the Phaedo is you have to see that Socrates is not one of those. Whatever it is that made Socrates, and he tells you in a way what it was, whatever made Socrates choose death in this situation is not a hatred of life. As a matter of fact, it's a love of life and of his life. And as he says, it has to do with my response to the verdict of the Athenian court. And I guess we might be running out of time. I should just put it this way. Socrates' choice is about the philosopher in his relation to the city. And I think he himself is not going to benefit, only to the extent that he can identify himself with philosophy, with the future of philosophy. That's where the good is going to come, that he is thinking about the whole future, of philosophy and identifying himself with that and choosing and seeing that that is in relation to the city. You can't simply violate the law. You guys are supposed to be good government. We didn't talk about good government at all, but we can say here that Socrates' understanding of the good, and here I differ with a lot of fellow interpreters, I do think he makes his decision not on the grounds of morality, not on the grounds of the just and the beautiful, but ultimately he sees his good, his self-interest must take account of the just and the noble and beautiful, and of the philosopher's relation to the city and to the law. And he does that in the end and figures out that his good requires accepting the verdict of the city. There's a lot packed into that statement that people can think about, but yeah.
Ronna, thank you so much for spending this time with us. This is very nice.
We came out more or less on time here with a lot of unanswered questions, but that's as it should be.
Well, you preempted. Maybe you could see it on my face. I was sitting here trying to think about how to wrap this up, and I was going to say, well, one last thing, like I were Columbo. What's good government?
We didn't get quite that far, but we did get to the philosopher in the city, which is certainly Plato's, obviously a central concern.
But the need for masks and the need for paper on which we inscribe philosophy is such a lovely concluding idea here of really showing us the complexity of what its need for to make the city safe for philosophy or philosophy safe for the city.
That and philosophy for itself.
Mm-hmm.
I think you want to put those two together. Keep the reader invited or compelled to philosophize himself or herself in reading these texts, because it isn't there on the surface. So Plato obviously was a master of those two motives, right? Making philosophy safe for the city safe for philosophy as much as possible, and philosophy itself, keeping it alive through writing, which is, as he has Socrates say, is not an easy thing to do. And
yes.
Also,
right.
I just throw out for people's invitation for people to further work. A lot of that last page you were reading from came to me from the Sophist and Statesman, because that's where Plato almost most explicitly addresses the problem of the hidden being of the philosopher behind these appearances. And a lot of those issues are spelled out in their own way in those two dialogues. Those are a great follow-up to, especially also because it's about the philosopher withdrawing. So it gives you a lot of clues to the Phaedo whenever he wrote these things.
Oh, so yeah, I want to bring this up real quickly before we go. Professor Berger is very serious that the cratylus does not occur dramatically in the midst of these 7 final dialogues. She says she doesn't want to hear otherwise, especially from Jake Howland, is what she told me.
Jake, forgive me. But somehow, there's another question for people's further work, right? Why is certainly explicitly connected somehow through these inspired revelatory etymologies with the Euthyphro and Theaetetus, and so what's it doing there? By the way, 2 of my grad students are now. I won't teach the cratylus. You have to know. Everybody has to know Greek too well. 2 of the grad students are working hard on the cratylus, so maybe we'll get some good answers.
Oh, nice.
I'll keep you guys posted.
Aaron, would you like to discuss anything else?
No, thank you so much.
I want to end by saying you guys are doing, I think, a really very interesting, important, and worthwhile project with your podcast.
Thank you.
It seems to be the way of the world, and people. I've talked to someone else who doesn't want to go to graduate school, wants to keep learning, and I recommended yours and 1 or 2 others, that there's so much resources now through the internet that didn't exist in my generation.
It's really fun. Some days are better than others. So for instance, we recorded our Fed 10 episodes. We released 2. I think we recorded 4 because we just weren't, it's probably me, and Aaron has to put up with me just being unhappy with it, you know?
I mean, that's the difference between this and writing. In writing, you're expected to go back over and over again.
I took all of those neuroses from writing and trying to get the sentences to flow and click. And then the first time when I started editing these and producing these, I spent hours moving words around, re-recording sections. It was completely unsustainable.
We were talking before about doing the Strauss and Benedetti too, transcriptions of their courses. And on the one hand, you kind of you have to edit a little bit from oral, but you don't want to overdo it because you lose the atmosphere of the spontaneous.
Oh, I can still hear him from when I, along with Blitz, did the Beyond Good and Evil from St. John's. You can hear Strauss saying, Nietzsche says, Plato is boring. And the way he draws out the word is really funny. And that just doesn't come through in the written transcript. You want to just keep adding O's to try and make it come alive.
Well, Benedetti has almost every sentence, right? Or yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I kept in a lot, but not all.
Ronna, thank you so much for taking this time to speak with us. It was wonderful having you.
And thank you. It really was great to spend this time in conversation.
I enjoyed it tremendously. It was just a pleasure to converse with you guys.
This has been the Good Government Podcast with Aaron Slutkin and Michael Hoffpauir.